Welcome to Still Science Lab. Tonight, we are going to confront a deeply unsettling mystery currently unfolding at the absolute, freezing edge of human reach. We are going to explore the terrifying implications of the recent catastrophic anomalies transmitted from the darkest depths of the solar system, and we are going to ask a profoundly disturbing question. Has Voyager detected a glitch in physics, and is this why the probe is slowly vanishing from our reality? We, as a species, desperately cling to the comforting, majestic narrative of space exploration as a glorious, triumphant march of human ingenuity and unyielding curiosity. But tonight, we are going to systematically strip away that heavily romanticized poetry. We are going to stare directly into the suffocating, pitch-black abyss of deep space and realize that the universe absolutely does not tolerate our mechanical trespasses. To understand the horrific, physical reality of what is currently happening to our most distant machine, we must first look back at the profound, almost heartbreaking arrogance of its origin. In the late summer of 1977, humanity accomplished what we still widely consider to be the absolute pinnacle of our technological and exploratory achievements. We constructed two fragile, one-ton chassis of aluminum, titanium, and silicon, equipped them with artificial brains that possessed a fraction of the computing power of a modern digital watch, strapped them to the top of massive, controlled chemical explosions, and violently hurled them outward into the dark. The Voyager probes were designed to be our ultimate emissaries, our mechanical eyes and ears sent to navigate the sprawling, deadly gravity wells of the outer gas giants. But more than just scientific instruments, they were designed to be the ultimate, permanent monuments to our own existence. Attached to the side of these primitive machines, we bolted the golden record. It is a literal, physical, gold-plated copper disc, meticulously engineered to survive for 1 billion years in the vacuum of space. It is the ultimate manifestation of human ego and our deepest, most paralyzing cosmic loneliness. We simply could not bear the existential dread of eventually dying out on this tiny rock without someone, somewhere, knowing that we were here. So, we encoded the acoustic vibrations of a baby crying, the sound of a human heartbeat, the spoken greetings in dozens of dead and living languages, and the mathematical, highly structured music of our greatest composers. We even included a precise, engraved map of our exact cosmic location, calculated by the relative distances to surrounding pulsars. We threw a message in a bottle into an infinite, roaring ocean, completely and arrogantly assuming that the ocean was calm, that the water was safe, and that a benevolent, a highly advanced observer was patiently waiting on the other shore to warmly receive it. We imagine Voyager gliding silently and majestically through a serene, frictionless void, bathing in the gentle, fading light of our distant sun, carrying the beautiful, unbroken spirit of humanity into eternity. This is the sanitized, macroscopic lie we eagerly tell ourselves to feel significant in a reality that mathematically despises us. But at 15 billion miles away, sitting in the agonizingly cold, crushing dark of the outer solar system, that comforting narrative has violently, irreparably fractured. The data coming back across the staggering, almost incomprehensible expanse of space has profoundly, terrifyingly changed. It takes over 22 hours for a single pulse of light, traveling at the absolute maximum speed the universe allows, to make the one-way trip from the probe to the giant radio dishes listening on Earth. And the agonizingly faint, highly degraded signal that finally washes over our receivers is no longer the pristine, orderly telemetry of a functioning machine. The probe has begun to stutter. Recent, highly publicized catastrophic glitches have crippled Voyager 1, causing the artificial brain to aggressively transmit repeating, nonsensical patterns of ones and zeros back to its creators. It is a continuous, coherent radio signal that has been completely, violently stripped of all logical, readable data. The engineers and technicians sitting in the comfortable, heavily climate-controlled laboratories of Earth desperately try to sanitize this horror. They issue calm, measured press releases blaming a single, localized, corrupted memory chip. They point to a faulty line of ancient code or the entirely expected physical degradation of fragile, 40-year-old hardware slowly freezing to death in the vacuum. They treat this terrifying anomaly as a mundane, terrestrial mechanical failure, an annoyance that can be logically diagnosed and patiently patched with a software update beamed from billions of miles away. But when you strip away the desperate optimism of the engineers and view this anomaly through the dark, unyielding lens of theoretical physics and existential reality, you realize they are fundamentally, tragically misinterpreting the symptoms. These catastrophic telemetry glitches are not simply the result of aging silicon or a random stray cosmic ray. They are the physical, mathematical manifestations of a machine violently crossing the absolute boundary of our localized reality. Voyager 1 has traveled so unimaginably far that it is no longer operating within the safe, predictable, and heavily sanitized physical environment that birthed it. It has crossed into a region of space where our local laws of physics, the comforting, orderly thermodynamic rules that govern the inner planets and the protective magnetic bubble of our star, are beginning to violently break down. The probe was meticulously engineered using the physics of Earth, perfectly calibrated to the quiet, predictable vacuum of the inner solar system. But it has now pierced the veil. It has forced its way out of the human terrarium. And the true, unshielded void on the other side is absolutely not empty, and it is most certainly not peaceful. The nonsensical babble of ones and zeros echoing across the 15 billion-mile abyss is not a simple hardware glitch. It is the terrifying symptom of a machine completely failing to process the alien high-energy physics of the true universe. It is a highly ordered artificial brain experiencing a profound, irreversible form of cosmic aphasia. Voyager is being overwhelmed by a physical reality it was mathematically never designed to comprehend. The invisible, highly radioactive environment of the interstellar medium is actively, aggressively crashing the fundamental logic gates of its ancient computer. The probe is desperately trying to measure, quantify, and report on a physical space that completely defies the parameters of its earthbound programming. It is staring directly into the terrifying, chaotic machinery of the cosmos, and its artificial mind is completely snapping under the impossible weight of the data. We listen to that repeating, empty signal, and we are forced to confront the paralyzing reality that Voyager is not simply flying away from us. It is actively, relentlessly being erased. It is being physically and mathematically overwritten by a profoundly hostile environment that actively destroys complex architecture. The glitch is the deafening sound of our localized reality fundamentally failing to translate the absolute horror of the interstellar void. The machine we sent to bravely conquer the stars is losing its grip on the very concept of data. It is slowly, inevitably vanishing from the physical parameters of our reality, crossing a dark, turbulent boundary from which no human logic, no human code, and absolutely no human memory can ever successfully return. We look up at the sprawling, diamond-dusted canopy of the night sky, and we harbor a deeply ingrained, fundamentally arrogant assumption about the nature of the cosmos. When we build our magnificent optical telescopes, when we launch our fragile satellites into low Earth orbit, and when we send our astronauts floating effortlessly in the dark, we eagerly convince ourselves that we are interacting with the raw, unfiltered universe. We believe that the empty, freezing vacuum of space resting just a few hundred miles above our atmosphere is the exact same empty, freezing vacuum that stretches out infinitely across the billions of light years of the cosmic web. We treat space as a uniform, homogeneous canvas, an endless, predictable ocean of silence governed by a strict, universal set of physical laws that we have successfully mastered. But this comforting, macroscopic belief is a spectacular, localized hallucination. The physical space we have explored, the environment we have sent our machines to measure, and the physical reality we have meticulously documented for centuries is absolutely not the true universe. It is a highly specific, heavily sanitized, and fiercely protected microenvironment. To truly understand the terrifying physical precipice that Voyager has currently reached, we must fundamentally redefine our relationship with our own star. We are biologically conditioned to view the sun as a gentle, passive orb of light and warmth, a benevolent celestial furnace peacefully anchoring our solar system. But the sun is absolutely not peaceful. It is a roaring, violently chaotic thermonuclear reactor, continuously and aggressively detonating millions of tons of superheated hydrogen every single microscopic fraction of a second. And this catastrophic, unending nuclear explosion does not merely radiate photons that warm our skin. The sun actively, relentlessly exhales a massive, highly charged hurricane of superheated subatomic particles. This raging, invisible storm of accelerated protons and electrons, known as the solar wind, blasts outward from the solar corona at millions of miles per hour, aggressively pushing against the dark, heavy, and crushing weight of deep space. As this relentless solar wind violently rushes outward, tearing past the rocky inner planets, sweeping over the massive gas giants, and plunging far beyond the frozen, lonely orbit of Pluto, it literally carves out an unimaginably vast, invisible cavity in the interstellar medium. It forcefully inflates a colossal, teardrop-shaped magnetic shield that completely and utterly encapsulates the entire solar system. Astrophysicists cleanly and clinically refer to this massive structure as the Heliosphere. But in the context of our existential survival and the terrifying mechanics of the cosmos, that academic terminology is far too gentle. The heliosphere is absolutely not just a region of gravitational influence. It is a heavily fortified, highly pressurized biological quarantine zone. It is a massive, localized bubble, actively, desperately holding back the crushing, highly radioactive apocalypse of the true cosmic ocean. Outside the relatively calm, predictable boundaries of this magnetic bubble lies the true vacuum, the interstellar medium. It is the chaotic, violent, and unimaginably vast space between the stars. And it is profoundly, aggressively hostile. The interstellar medium is not an empty void. It is a highly radioactive, deeply chaotic ocean, completely saturated with ancient, high-energy cosmic rays, the violently expelled radioactive shrapnel of dead, exploding supernovas, and the highly degraded, chaotic dust of shattered planetary systems. If the Earth were to be suddenly, miraculously stripped of the Sun's massive heliospheric protection, our planet would be instantly, violently bombarded by this lethal cosmic radiation. The delicate, highly ordered biological structures of our DNA would be aggressively shredded at the subatomic level. Our atmosphere would be brutally stripped away, and the fragile, temporary glitch of biological life would be permanently, immediately erased. The quarantine zone is the absolute, singular reason why humanity is permitted to exist on this rock. This terrifying physical reality forces us to confront a profound, deeply paralyzing epistemological nightmare. Every single scientific measurement we have ever made, every fundamental law of physics we have confidently written down in our textbooks, every chemical reaction we have ever observed, and every single mathematical observation of the cosmos has been completely, entirely filtered through the thick, magnetic walls of this biological terrarium. We are exactly like microscopic, deeply fragile deep-sea creatures living our entire fleeting lives inside a tiny, brilliantly illuminated and heavily pressurized diving bell. We look out through the thick glass, measure the highly controlled, sanitized water circulating inside our tiny vessel, and arrogantly assume that those measurements perfectly, flawlessly represent the raging, freezing, and crushing depths of the Marianas Trench. We have never actually experienced the true universe. We have never dragged our scientific instruments through the raw, unfiltered, and highly destructive radiation of the interstellar void. Our entire understanding of physics, of quantum mechanics, and of thermodynamic decay is deeply, fundamentally biased by the highly localized, relatively calm environment generated by the localized breath of our dying star. We desperately cling to the comforting belief that the rules that govern the inner solar system are universal constants, uniformly applicable to every single dark corner of the infinite void. But what if they are not? What if the highly structured, predictable laws of physics we hold so dear are simply localized weather patterns, highly specific, temporary conditions that only mathematically function inside the protective, magnetic bubble of a burning thermonuclear engine? This is the exact, terrifying physical boundary that Voyager 1 has now violently breached. For nearly 40 years, the fragile probe coasted blindly through the familiar, relatively safe, and highly predictable environment of the heliosphere, calmly measuring the orderly plasma of the solar wind, operating exactly as its earth-bound engineers predicted. But at 15 billion miles away, Voyager absolutely did not just keep flying into more of the same empty space. It physically, violently punched through the outer walls of our localized reality. It is the very first piece of human architecture, the very first highly organized extension of human consciousness to leave the sanitized biological quarantine zone and plunge directly into the raw, unfiltered, and profoundly hostile physics of the true void. When you truly understand the sheer, catastrophic shift in the physical environment that Voyager has just experienced, the nonsensical, stuttering telemetry glitches suddenly stop looking like simple, mundane hardware failures. They begin to look exactly like the physical, mathematical symptoms of a machine being violently crushed by an alien reality. Voyager was meticulously built using the physics of the terrarium, its delicate silicon brains, its primitive, highly structured memory banks, and its heavily engineered logic gates were all perfectly calibrated to survive the predictable radiation of the solar bubble. They were never actually designed to withstand the brutal, chaotic, and unimaginably high-energy physics of the interstellar medium. As the probe forces its way out of the quarantine zone, it is being completely and utterly saturated by an entirely new, highly destructive spectrum of ancient cosmic radiation. The fundamental, subatomic rules of electrical resistance, magnetic interference, and quantum stability that allowed its computers to function flawlessly for decades are beginning to aggressively warp and break down under the crushing pressure of the true vacuum. The universe outside the bubble does not recognize our localized mathematical laws, and it certainly does not respect the fragile architecture of our primitive technology. Voyager is desperately, frantically trying to run Earth-based software in an environment where the underlying physical hardware of reality itself has fundamentally, irreversibly changed. We are not simply losing contact with a distant probe, we are receiving the very first, terrifying sensory feedback from a reality we were never, ever meant to touch. The repeating, corrupted data of ones and zeros streaming back across the void is the agonizing, digital scream of a localized, highly ordered system being aggressively dismantled by the chaotic, apathetic physics of the cosmos. Voyager is acting exactly like a fragile submarine that has ventured far, far past its maximum structural crush depth. The immense, alien pressure of the dark is slowly, inevitably buckling its hull, violently short-circuiting its highly organized electrical grids, and forcing its logic processors to descend into a state of complete, unrecoverable cosmic aphasia. The machine is stuttering, failing, and dying because it has physically entered a region of space where human machines and human physics are completely, undeniably obsolete. It is slowly vanishing from our reality because our localized reality fundamentally ends at the exact boundary line it just crossed, leaving it completely exposed, completely alone, and entirely at the mercy of a universe that mathematically demands its absolute destruction. We are fundamentally, biologically conditioned by our terrestrial environment to believe that boundaries are sharp, cleanly defined, and peaceful. When we imagine a spacecraft leaving the solar system, our minds automatically conjure a highly romanticized, deeply sanitized cinematic sequence. We envision a gentle, silent transition, like a grand ship smoothly sailing out of a calm, quiet harbor and effortlessly gliding into the still, dark waters of an infinite ocean. We assume that the radiant light of the sun simply, gradually dims into insignificance, that the localized warmth slowly fades into the ambient freezing vacuum, and that the fragile probe simply coasts uninterrupted into the great, empty beyond. We desperately want to believe that the edges of our reality fade out with a whisper, but the strict, unyielding laws of astrophysics, fluid dynamics, and thermodynamics absolutely dictate a reality that is infinitely more violent, profoundly chaotic, and deeply terrifying. Space is not a passive, empty vacuum waiting to be explored. It is a highly pressurized, fiercely contested cosmic battleground of competing forces. And the physical boundary that separates our localized, sanitized biological terrarium from the true, hostile interstellar void is not a quiet fading of the light. It is a catastrophic, boiling wall of cosmic fire. To comprehend the sheer, staggering trauma that Voyager had to physically endure just to escape our local reality, we must examine the violent physics of the solar wind. For billions of miles, the superheated, highly charged plasma violently exhaled by our dying star expands outward in every direction at a staggering speed of over 1,000,000 miles per hour. It travels unimpeded through the inner solar system, forcefully carving out the protective magnetic bubble of the heliosphere, aggressively pushing back the ancient, highly radioactive dust and the crushing, heavy pressure of the interstellar medium. Inside this massive bubble, the physical environment is entirely dominated by the outward breath of the Sunday. But the Sun's thermonuclear engine is not infinite, and its outward pressure has a strict mathematical limit. The interstellar medium is not empty. It possesses its own massive crushing density and its own incredibly powerful magnetic fields. Eventually, at a staggering, deeply isolating distance of roughly 9 billion miles from the Earth, the relentless outward force of the solar wind finally, inevitably equals the crushing inward pressure of the interstellar void. When a massive, continuous wave of highly charged plasma traveling at over 1,000,000 miles an hour suddenly collides with an immovable, crushing cosmic wall, it absolutely does not simply stop. It violently, catastrophically crashes. This localized, physical apocalypse is known in the cold, empirical language of astrophysics as the termination shock. It is the exact, terrifying coordinate where the majestic dominance of the Sun violently shatters. The supersonic solar wind is brutally and suddenly forced to decelerate to subsonic speeds. As this massive volume of plasma rapidly, violently slams on the brakes, it aggressively compresses, and its temperature violently spikes to millions of degrees. The orderly, predictable magnetic fields that were carried outward by the solar plasma are brutally crushed together, violently twisting, snapping, and reconnecting in a chaotic, highly radioactive frenzy of subatomic destruction. The termination shock is not a simple line on a stellar map. It is a massive, brutal, and unimaginably turbulent wall of superheated plasma. It is a magnetic meat grinder. It forms a literal, spherical wall of fire that completely encircles our entire solar system, a chaotic, churning barrier of violently decelerating subatomic shrapnel that actively separates the sanitized, predictable human quarantine zone from the true, profoundly hostile physics of the galactic ocean. And just beyond this boiling shockwave lies the heliopause, the absolute, final boundary layer. This is the stagnant, highly pressurized, and deeply turbulent frontier where the solar wind and the interstellar medium are locked in a permanent, violent, and highly radioactive stalemate. To actually leave the solar system, to cross over into the true vacuum of the universe, an object cannot simply float peacefully away. It must forcefully, physically, and aggressively punch its way straight through this boiling, localized apocalypse. Now, you must forcefully inject the fragile, archaic, and deeply primitive architecture of Voyager 1 into the center of this cosmic meat grinder. In the winter of 2004, this delicate, one-ton chassis of aluminum, copper, and ancient silicon did not gently sail into the interstellar dark. It violently, blindly collided head-on with the termination shock. We sent a highly primitive 1970s machine, a fragile artifact equipped with completely unshielded wires, exposed optical sensors, and a digital brain infinitely less powerful than a modern digital watch, directly into the most turbulent, highly charged magnetic storm in the known solar system. We hurled our greatest, most romanticized emissary straight into a boiling wall of cosmic fire, completely and arrogantly expecting it to survive the crossing with its deeply fragile digital sanity perfectly intact. For years, Voyager was relentlessly, aggressively battered by this localized apocalypse. As it plunged into the termination shock, the fragile probe was entirely submerged in a boiling, chaotic sea of superheated plasma. Its delicate, highly calibrated magnetic sensors were completely overwhelmed, violently thrown into chaos by the snapping, twisting, and completely unpredictable magnetic fields of the boundary layer. Its primitive, highly vulnerable, solid-state memory banks were aggressively bombarded by a sudden, massive, and entirely unprecedented spike in high-energy cosmic radiation. The fact that the fragile machine did not instantly vaporize, the fact that its archaic logic gates did not completely melt down into useless silicon slag the exact microsecond it hit the massive wall of superheated plasma, is a testament to an almost absurd, highly improbable level of human engineering luck. But the unyielding laws of physics dictate that a system cannot endure that level of catastrophic trauma without paying a permanent, horrific price. You absolutely cannot physically drag a highly organized, fragile piece of digital architecture through a boiling wall of cosmic fire and expect it to emerge on the other side unaltered. The brutal, violent crossing of the termination shock and the agonizing, turbulent crawl through the heliopause fundamentally, physically, and irreversibly altered the machine. The extreme thermal shock, the chaotic magnetic turbulence, and the aggressive, subatomic bombardment permanently degraded its delicate hardware. It was the physical, mathematical equivalent of dragging a complex, highly sensitive, neurological brain through a literal radioactive blender. When Voyager finally, agonizingly breached the absolute outer edge of the heliopause in 2012, permanently leaving the human quarantine zone behind and entering the true, unfiltered vacuum of the interstellar medium, it was already a deeply traumatized, heavily damaged artifact. The terrifying realization that our entire existence is completely, permanently surrounded by this violent, boiling wall of plasma forces, a profound, highly claustrophobic shift in how we view our place in the cosmos. We are absolutely not free explorers with an open, peaceful invitation to sail the galaxy. We are fragile biological prisoners securely locked inside a heavily fortified, pressurized cell, and the walls of our cell are made of chaotic, burning radiation. The universe has meticulously constructed a localized apocalypse to keep the deadly high-energy physics of the true void out, but simultaneously it serves as a terrifying, violent barrier to keep us permanently trapped within. Voyager's agonizing, brutal journey through the termination shock is a terrifying physical warning to our species. It is the raw, empirical proof that the universe absolutely does not want us to leave, and it will violently, aggressively punish any highly ordered structure that attempts to breach the boundary. The machine survived the wall of fire, but the microscopic damage it sustained was permanent, terminal, and mathematically inescapable. It forcefully punched its way into the true vacuum, but it carried the fatal, invisible wounds of its violent crossing deep within its primitive silicon architecture. The stuttering telemetry, the chaotic glitches, and the slow, inevitable descent into cosmic aphasia that we are witnessing today are not sudden, inexplicable failures. They are the delayed, inevitable, and terrifying symptoms of a fragile, artificial mind that was fundamentally, irrevocably broken the exact moment it tried to violently punch its way out of the only reality it was ever designed to understand. Voyager is a severely traumatized survivor wandering blindly into the dark, entirely unaware that the violent crossing has already mathematically guaranteed its absolute, impending destruction. For nearly half a century, we have desperately listened to the dark and expected it to speak our language. We built a machine out of aluminum, copper, and early silicon, encoded it with the rigid, unyielding mathematical logic of our terrestrial physics, and violently hurled it toward the absolute edge of our reality. For decades, Voyager served as a flawless, highly reliable tether to the unknown. It dutifully navigated the crushing gravity wells of the outer gas giants and coasted through the vast, empty stretches of the outer solar system, relentlessly beaming back perfectly structured, highly organized packets of human logic. The telemetry we received was pristine, a deeply comforting validation of our own localized physics. It allowed us to maintain the arrogant, macroscopic delusion that the universe was an orderly, predictable machine that we could simply map, quantify, and eventually conquer. We treated the sprawling abyss as a passive, obedient subject waiting to be catalogued by our primitive terrestrial mathematics. But the true unfiltered abyss is absolutely not passive, and it absolutely does not respect the fragile, heavily structured architecture of human logic. Across an incomprehensible, terrifying gulf of over 15 billion miles, that deeply comforting conversation violently and inexplicably shattered. The massive, highly sensitive radio dishes scattered across the Earth, straining with all their technological might to catch the microscopic, fading whisper of a 22-watt transmitter, suddenly locked onto something profoundly wrong. The carrier wave was absolutely still there. The machine was technically still alive, still drawing power from its decaying nuclear heart, and still desperately, relentlessly trying to communicate with its creators. But the data stream itself had been entirely, violently stripped of all meaning. Instead of the highly complex, meticulously ordered telemetry detailing plasma density, magnetic field fluctuations, and the physical parameters of deep space, Voyager abruptly began screaming a perfect, endless, and entirely nonsensical pattern of ones and zeros. It was a coherent, powerful radio signal that contained absolutely zero readable data. There is a highly specific, deeply suffocating psychological terror inherent in this exact kind of mechanical failure. If the fragile probe had simply gone silent, if the degrading nuclear battery had finally exhausted its fuel, or if a microscopic piece of high-velocity cosmic dust had violently shattered its main antenna, we could have easily accepted that outcome as a mundane, physical death. The loss would be sad, but it would be mathematically logical. But Voyager did not die. It continued to speak with absolute, unbroken clarity, but the language itself had rapidly degenerated into pure mechanical madness. It is the terrifying, digital equivalent of walking into a sterile, brightly lit room and finding a deeply trusted, brilliant friend staring blankly at the wall, fluently and frantically reciting a random string of vowels with absolute, terrifying urgency. The physical structure of communication remained perfectly intact, but the soul of the logic, the capacity for meaning, had been violently and completely excised. Immediately, The architects of this mission, safely insulated in their heavily climate-controlled, sanitized laboratories on Earth, desperately scrambled to construct a comforting, macroscopic narrative to explain away the horror. They frantically wrapped the terrifying anomaly in the sterile, unthreatening, and deeply familiar language of terrestrial computer science. They clinically diagnosed the nightmare as a simple memory fault within the flight data subsystem. They hypothesized, with desperate optimism, that a single, stray cosmic ray had violently flipped a microscopic magnetic bit in the ancient silicon architecture, causing the primitive computer to become helplessly trapped in an endless, looping execution cycle. They treated the terrified, babbling machine floating at the very edge of the universe exactly like a stubborn office computer that simply needed to be remotely rebooted. It is the ultimate, paralyzing manifestation of human arrogance to assume that the microscopic failures of our primitive technology remain exactly the same when completely exposed to the raw, unfiltered, and deeply hostile architecture of the true cosmos. We must violently abandon these comforting, localized rationalizations. Voyager is absolutely no longer operating within the safe, heavily sanitized physics of the human biological terrarium. It has physically, forcefully punched its way through the boiling wall of cosmic fire at the termination shock, and it is now completely submerged in the true, unshielded vacuum of the interstellar medium. This is not the quiet, empty space of our local solar system. It is a violently hostile, highly radioactive ocean, completely saturated with the decaying, high-energy subatomic shrapnel of dead stars that violently exploded billions of years ago. When you plunge a highly ordered, incredibly fragile, artificial brain constructed using the physics of Earth in 1977 directly into an environment governed by alien, catastrophic, and high-energy physics, you are not simply risking a mundane software bug. You are subjecting the very physical structure of human logic to an unyielding, apocalyptic, cosmic crush. What we are actually witnessing in the repeating, nonsensical stream of ones and zeros is not a simple corruption of a memory bank. It is the agonizing, real-time manifestation of a machine completely and utterly failing to process the alien reality of the true void. Voyager's exposed optical sensors, its fragile plasma wave antennas, and its delicate magnetometers are desperately, frantically trying to measure an environment that entirely, mathematically defies the rigid parameters of its earthbound programming. The sheer, incomprehensible weight of the raw, unfiltered cosmic data is aggressively crashing against its primitive logic gates. The machine is actively trying to observe the infinite, and the infinite is violently, mathematically shattering its capacity to understand. Philosophically and physically, Voyager is experiencing a profound, irreversible descent into cosmic aphasia. Aphasia in the human biological brain occurs when physical trauma destroys the neurological centers responsible for language comprehension. The victim can hear the words and they can speak, but the fundamental bridge between sound and meaning is permanently destroyed. Voyager has suffered the exact same catastrophic trauma, but on a macrocosmic scale. The high-energy cosmic radiation of the interstellar medium is actively, continuously sandblasting the delicate physical architecture of its memory banks, violently altering the organized subatomic structures that hold our mathematical language together. The physical hardware is not just glitching. The The physical laws that allow the hardware to function are being rewritten by the environment. The strict, rigid terrestrial rules of cause and effect, the predictable geometry of the inner planets, and the comforting reliability of its own internal digital monologue are being aggressively, relentlessly overwritten by the chaotic, apathetic static of the deep cosmos. The machine is desperately trying to format the unformatable. The repeating sequence of ones and zeros is not a hidden message, and it is not a cry for help. It is the chaotic, bleeding wreckage of human logic buckling under the impossible pressure of an alien physics it was never designed to survive. Voyager is literally, physically forgetting how to be a human machine. The fragile, highly structured logic that we so arrogantly packed into its silicon brain is dissolving, melting away into the chaotic background radiation of a universe that actively despises highly ordered systems. We are forced to sit in our safe, pressurized, terrestrial laboratories and helplessly listen to the digital death rattle of our greatest emissary. It is a profoundly isolating, deeply terrifying realization that entirely shatters the illusion of our cosmic mastery. We sent our mechanical proxy to the very edge of our localized reality, hoping it would boldly map the great beyond, and the reality it actually found there was so profoundly hostile, so fundamentally and mathematically alien, that it instantly drove the machine into a state of permanent, localized insanity. The glitch is the cold, empirical proof that our highly structured human physics, our deeply cherished logic, and our desperate psychological need for order absolutely do not apply to the true, dark ocean of the universe. Voyager is out there, freezing in the absolute dark, stripped of its exploratory purpose, blindly screaming empty, mechanical noise into an infinite, roaring abyss that will never, ever understand it. We are helplessly, permanently tethered to its madness, forced to watch the absolute pinnacle of human achievement slowly dissolve into a babbling, broken ghost on the very terrifying frontier of physical existence. When we peer through the lenses of our most powerful terrestrial telescopes, we are biologically and naturally drawn to the light. We fixate our attention on the brilliant, burning spheres of plasma, the swirling, majestic arms of distant galaxies, and the glowing, intricate nebulas that paint the cosmos in vibrant, beautiful hues. Because our fragile, highly evolved biological eyes were engineered entirely by nature to detect and interpret photons, we possess a deeply ingrained, almost inescapable neurological bias. We look at the sprawling, pitch-black expanses between these glowing celestial objects, and we fundamentally, instinctively categorize that darkness as an absolute absence. We comfortably call it the vacuum of space. We imagine it as a silent, sterile, and perfectly empty stage, a pristine blank canvas upon which the universe merely places its burning stars and heavy planets. We desperately want to believe that the space between worlds is nothing more than a harmless, frictionless void, a quiet, completely passive highway that allows light and solid matter to travel completely undisturbed. But this comforting, macroscopic assumption is one of the most dangerous, spectacular illusions ever entertained by human consciousness. The darkness between the stars is absolutely not empty. It is not a silent, passive theater, and it is most certainly not a vacuum. The interstellar medium is a highly physical, incredibly dense, and violently active ocean, and it is one of the most profoundly hostile, deeply radioactive environments in the entire mathematical structure of reality. To truly understand the absolute, suffocating horror of the environment that Voyager has now blindly wandered into, you must violently discard the comforting concept of empty space. The true vacuum simply does not exist. The interstellar medium is a churning, chaotic, and heavily saturated physical substance. It is a massive, invisible sea composed of highly diffuse clouds of freezing hydrogen and helium gas, swirling, unpredictable magnetic fields of incomprehensible scale, and massive, sprawling banks of microscopic, highly abrasive interstellar dust. But the sheer existential dread of this cosmic ocean does not simply come from its physical density. It comes from its staggering apocalyptic energy. While Voyager was safely coasting within the protective magnetic bubble of the Heliosphere, it was heavily shielded from the true, unadulterated fury of this environment. The massive, outward pressure of the solar wind acted as a highly effective, localized biological quarantine zone, aggressively pushing back against the crushing weight and the lethal radiation of the greater galaxy. But the exact, terrifying microsecond the fragile probe violently punched through the termination shock and crossed the absolute boundary of the heliopause, that protective magnetic armor was completely, permanently stripped away. Voyager stepped out of the pressurized diving bell and was immediately, violently submerged in the raw, unfiltered, and deeply lethal currents of the true cosmic ocean. And this ocean is heavily, densely polluted with the catastrophic, decaying wreckage of dead stars. The universe is not a peaceful, orderly system. It is a sprawling, infinite graveyard that is constantly, violently churning its own physical matter. Millions of years ago, perhaps billions of years before the Earth even coalesced from the chaotic, swirling accretion disk of our young sun, massive, brilliant blue giant stars completely exhausted their nuclear fuel. When these colossal, burning engines finally died, they did not simply fade away gracefully into the dark. They violently, catastrophically collapsed in upon themselves and instantly rebounded in blinding, apocalyptic supernova explosions. These were highly localized cosmic execution events that completely shattered the physical architecture of the stars, violently tearing their highly ordered atomic structures apart and furiously hurling the resulting subatomic debris outward at staggering, incomprehensible speeds. This intensely radioactive shrapnel from the absolute dawn of the cosmos is still traveling. It never stopped. The interstellar medium is completely densely saturated with these ancient high-energy particles, known in the clinical, heavily sanitized language of astrophysics as galactic cosmic rays. But you must absolutely not think of them as gentle rays of light. They are fierce, physical, and deeply destructive projectiles. They are naked protons, highly charged electrons, and the heavy, brutally stripped atomic nuclei of iron and carbon, completely devoid of their protective electron shells, screaming through the pitch-black void at significant fractions of the speed of light. They are the violent, decaying ghosts of dead stars, relentlessly haunting the dark, cold spaces of the galaxy. And because there is no thick planetary atmosphere, no terrestrial magnetic field, and no localized solar bubble out there to slow them down or deflect their chaotic, entirely unpredictable trajectories, these high-velocity subatomic bullets travel unimpeded through the interstellar medium with absolutely terrifying kinetic lethality. This is the profound, suffocating reality of the radioactive graveyard that Voyager has now permanently entered. It is a completely naked, highly fragile artifact of primitive human engineering, entirely exposed to a relentless, unyielding, and microscopic firing squad. Every single second of every single day, the delicate aluminum chassis, the thin copper wiring, and the ancient, highly structured silicon memory banks of the probe are being violently, aggressively bombarded by this ancient cosmic shrapnel. When a high-energy galactic cosmic ray physically strikes the metallic hull of Voyager, it does not simply bounce off harmlessly. It hits with such staggering, localized kinetic energy that it violently shatters the atomic bonds of the metal itself. The brutal impact initiates a catastrophic, microscopic chain reaction, a cascading shower of secondary radiation that aggressively bleeds deep into the internal, highly protected cavities of the machine. The universe is actively, relentlessly sandblasting the probe at the absolute fundamental, subatomic level. It is a slow, agonizing, and entirely inescapable process of physical and mathematical erasure. The interstellar medium actively, fiercely despises highly ordered, complex architecture. The environment mathematically demands total, uniform chaos, and Voyager is a deeply offensive, highly concentrated pocket of artificial order that the cosmos is currently working to violently correct. As the ancient, radioactive shrapnel of dead stars continuously crashes into the delicate logic gates of Voyager's central computer, it physically alters the electrical states of the silicon. It forcefully injects chaotic, meaningless thermal energy into the meticulously ordered, rigid structure of human mathematics. The cosmic rays are literally, physically rewriting the core operating system of the machine, aggressively replacing the logical, predictable commands of our terrestrial physics with the dark, apathetic, and highly radioactive static of the void. We arrogantly launched our greatest emissary to beautifully sail the peaceful, majestic ocean of the stars, completely and tragically unaware that the water is furiously boiling with lethal radiation. We sent a fragile, primitive machine into a highly contested, violent cosmic battleground where the decaying, radioactive corpses of exploded suns are constantly, aggressively tearing apart absolutely anything that dares to maintain a complex structure. Voyager is not peacefully gliding toward a new, beautiful destination. It is blindly, helplessly wading through a dense, lethal minefield of subatomic shrapnel. Every single microscopic impact degrades its hardware, forcefully scrambles its fragile digital sanity, and edges the lonely machine closer to total, unrecoverable system failure. The true vacuum is an absolute, uncompromising executioner. It does not possess the mathematical capacity for mercy, and it absolutely does not care about the romanticized, heavy emotional weight of the golden record bolted to the probe's side. The interstellar medium is slowly, methodically, and violently dismantling our technological masterpiece, tearing its highly complex architecture apart atom by agonizing atom. The stuttering telemetry and the terrifying, nonsensical glitches we are currently receiving on Earth are simply the distant, agonizing echoes of a machine being physically crushed to death by the raw, unfiltered weight of the cosmos. Voyager is a severely traumatized, deeply irradiated artifact, desperately trying to survive in a profoundly hostile, dead ocean that is mathematically guaranteed to eventually grind it down into unrecognizable, silent metallic dust. We are forced to helplessly watch from our safe, pressurized biological quarantine zone as the true universe actively, aggressively digests our boldest attempt at immortality, proving with cold, empirical ruthlessness that the dark spaces between the stars are absolutely not empty. They are overflowing with the violent, inescapable machinery of absolute cosmic decay. We desperately cling to the deeply comforting, highly psychological illusion that our connection to the physical machines we hurl into the dark is permanent. When we launch a probe, we imagine an unbreakable, invisible tether stretching across the vast expanse of the cosmos, a pristine, digital umbilical cord that firmly anchors the machine to our localized terrestrial reality. We are biologically conditioned by our modern, hyper-connected society to view communication as an absolute, instantaneous, and infinitely powerful phenomenon. We casually beam high-definition video across massive oceans in microscopic fractions of a second, and we arrogantly project this localized, terrestrial mastery onto the crushing, infinite scale of deep space. We believe that as long as the nuclear battery inside Voyager continues to slowly decay, providing a faint pulse of electrical life to its ancient silicon heart, the machine will successfully speak to us. We assume that the vacuum of space is a perfectly silent, empty conduit that will dutifully carry our telemetry home forever. But this assumption is a spectacular, macroscopic delusion that completely ignores the brutal, unyielding, and profoundly apathetic geometry of the universe. The cosmos is absolutely not a passive, silent conduit. It is an aggressively hostile, overwhelmingly loud, and fiercely destructive environment governed by mathematical laws that actively, relentlessly seek to dilute, scatter, and completely erase any highly ordered signal that dares to cross it. To truly comprehend the agonizing physical execution of Voyager's voice, you must first look at the pathetic, almost laughable fragility of its vocal cords. At the very center of this dying artifact, buried beneath layers of freezing aluminum and protective thermal blankets, sits a deeply archaic, heavily degraded radio transmitter. When Voyager wants to speak to the Earth, when it desperately attempts to hurl its heavily encoded, highly structured telemetry across 15 billion miles of empty, freezing void, it must rely on this primitive piece of hardware. The maximum output of this transmitter is 22 watts. It is the exact, pathetic equivalent of the faint, yellow incandescent bulb illuminating the inside of your kitchen refrigerator. We placed a microscopic, fragile, 22-watt spark of human logic in the absolute center of an infinitely expanding, freezing darkness, and we arrogantly demanded that its faint, desperate light pierce the abyss and successfully reach our eyes. But the universe absolutely does not allow a localized, concentrated burst of energy to remain concentrated. It enforces a strict, uncompromising, and geometrically terrifying mechanism of execution known as the inverse square law of radiation. In the comforting, sanitized environment of Earth, we rarely notice the lethal implications of this law. But in the sprawling, incomprehensible scale of deep space, it is an absolute, mathematical death sentence. When Voyager fires its 22-watt radio signal toward the inner solar system, that electromagnetic energy does not travel in a perfectly straight, tightly contained, and unbreakable laser beam. It violently expands. The photons radiate outward, stretching across the surface of an ever-inflating massive three-dimensional sphere. The brutal mathematics of the inverse square law dictate that every single time the distance from the probe doubles, the physical area that the signal must cover does not simply double, it multiplies by 4. This means that the highly ordered, concentrated energy of the telemetry is aggressively, exponentially diluted. By the time that fragile 22-watt signal has traveled just a few million miles, it has already been stretched so agonizingly thin that its physical impact is almost entirely negligible. But the signal must travel 15 billion miles. It must cross the hostile, radioactive ocean of the interstellar medium, violently plunge back through the chaotic, boiling wall of the termination shock, swim against the massive, outward pressure of the solar wind, and successfully navigate the heavy, crushing gravity wells of the inner planets. By the time the heavily degraded, utterly exhausted photons finally wash over the surface of the Earth 22 hours later, the signal is unimaginably, staggeringly faint. The energy that actually reaches our massive monolithic radio dishes is roughly 1/10 of a billionth of a trillionth of a single watt. We are desperately trying to detect the kinetic impact of a single, falling snowflake in the middle of a raging, continent-spanning blizzard. To catch this microscopic, dying whisper, humanity has constructed the Deep Space Network, a sprawling, global array of colossal, highly sensitive parabolic antennas. These massive mechanical ears stare blindly into the dark, utilizing incredibly complex, supercooled receiving equipment just to physically separate Voyager's agonizingly faint pulse from the ambient, electronic noise of our own planet. We treat this staggering technological feat as a triumphant victory over the void, but the crushing, inescapable reality of the inverse square law guarantees that our victory is strictly temporary and mathematically doomed. Voyager is not stationary. It is relentlessly, blindly plunging deeper into the dark at over 38,000 miles per hour. Every single second of every single day, the physical distance between the transmitter and the receiver increases, and the spherical surface area of the expanding signal aggressively multiplies. The probe is being continuously, mathematically executed by the fundamental geometry of space. The tether is stretching, thinning, and rapidly approaching the absolute limit of physical detection. But the sheer existential dread of this cosmic execution does not merely come from the fading strength of the signal. It comes from the terrifying, violent nature of the environment that the signal is fading into. We desperately want to believe that the deep universe is silent, that Voyager is simply whispering into a quiet, empty room. But the universe is absolutely, deafeningly loud. The cosmos is entirely saturated with a massive, roaring and chaotic hiss of ancient thermal static known as the cosmic microwave background. This is the decaying, heavily degraded, and highly disorganized radioactive afterglow of the Big Bang itself. It is the raw, violent, and completely apathetic noise of the universe's chaotic birth. A uniform, freezing wall of electromagnetic static that permeates absolutely every single cubic inch of the infinite void. This is the ultimate, paralyzing horror of Voyager's current physical state. The highly ordered, heavily structured 22-watt signal containing the logic, the mathematics, and the fragile digital sanity of our greatest emissary is becoming so staggeringly, unimaginably faint that its physical energy level is actively dropping below the energy level of the cosmic background radiation. Voyager is not simply getting quiet. It is physically, mathematically dissolving into the dead thermal static of the cosmos. The highly specific, organized arrangement of photons that constitutes human communication is being violently swallowed by the chaotic, random, and meaningless noise of the universe. We are forced to sit in our heavily pressurized terrestrial laboratories and bear witness to a terrifying macroscopic process of physical erasure. When the radio dishes point toward the outer dark, they are no longer listening to a distinct, localized machine. They are listening to a ghost slowly losing its voice in a roaring cosmic hurricane. The signal is being violently sandblasted by the raw, unyielding static of creation. The ones and zeros are mathematically bleeding into the ambient, freezing background radiation, entirely losing their structural cohesion and completely dissolving into the chaotic thermal noise. You must deeply internalize the suffocating implication of this mathematical blending. When the energy of a highly ordered signal drops below the energy of the chaotic static surrounding it, the information is not just difficult to hear, according to the strict, uncompromising laws of information theory and thermodynamics. The information is permanently, irrevocably destroyed. The universe does not simply hide the data, it actively, aggressively erases it. Voyager is screaming into an abyss that is mathematically designed to completely drown it out. Sometime in the incredibly near future, as the geometric dilution continues its ruthless, exponential progression, the final, faint whisper of the probe will physically cross that absolute, terrifying threshold. The signal will perfectly, seamlessly blend into the cosmic microwave background, entirely indistinguishable from the dead, random noise of the Big Bang. The machine will still be out there in the freezing dark, its degrading nuclear heart still weakly pushing electrons through its freezing, irradiated circuits. It will still be desperately, blindly trying to transmit its telemetry back to a home that can no longer hear it. But mathematically, physically, and existentially, the umbilical cord will permanently snap. The heavily structured logic of human existence will be completely swallowed by the apathetic, roaring chaos of the infinite void. We will have permanently lost our farthest emissary, not to a sudden, violent explosion, but to the slow, creeping, and absolutely inescapable erasure of a universe that violently demands uniform, dead static, actively digesting our desperate, localized whisper until absolutely nothing of our presence remains in the dark. We are biologically hardwired by millions of years of evolutionary survival to possess a deeply comforting, absolute faith in a psychological concept known as object permanence. When you sit in a brightly lit room and slowly close your eyes, you do not suffer a paralyzing panic attack under the assumption that the walls, the floor, and the furniture have suddenly ceased to exist. You inherently trust that the physical universe is objective, solid, and entirely independent of your conscious observation. We carry this fundamental, macroscopic delusion with us when we look up at the night sky. We assume that the distant dead planets, the swirling galaxies, and the fragile, freezing machines we hurl into the dark are permanent, physical fixtures occupying highly specific, measurable coordinates in a rigid, geometric grid of reality. We desperately want to believe that even if we completely look away, even if we lose all physical contact, the object remains anchored to the exact same timeline, faithfully continuing its silent journey through the void. But when you completely strip away the comforting illusions of classical physics and stare directly into the terrifying, reality-breaking basement of quantum mechanics, this assumption violently shatters. The universe is absolutely not an objective, solid stage. Reality is a highly conditional, deeply fragile negotiation, and observation is the only thing keeping the physical world from completely unraveling. To comprehend the profound, existential horror of what is about to happen to our farthest emissary, you must first confront the most deeply unsettling, empirically proven paradox in all of theoretical physics: the observer effect. In the sterile, microscopic realm of quantum mechanics, a particle does not actually possess a definitive physical state, a specific location, or a set trajectory until it violently interacts with its environment. Before that interaction occurs, the particle exists in a ghostly, undefined haze of absolute probability, mathematically occupying every single possible state simultaneously in what physicists call a quantum superposition. It is only the act of measurement, the physical, aggressive intrusion of an observer or an interacting system, that forces that chaotic wave of infinite possibilities to instantly, violently collapse into a single, localized, and definitive reality. This physical process of locking a quantum system into a solid state through interaction is known as decoherence. In the fundamental architecture of the cosmos, interaction is the heavy, inescapable anchor that physically tethers an object to a specific timeline. Without the anchor of observation, the universe simply refuses to make a definitive choice, leaving the isolated object to dissolve back into a chaotic, smeared wave of mathematical maybe. For nearly half a century, we have subconsciously treated the Voyager probe as a standard, classical object. But in the terrifying, unyielding framework of relational quantum mechanics, macroscopic objects are not exempt from the laws of the subatomic void. They are simply massive, highly complex collections of quantum data. And for 47 years, humanity has maintained a continuous, aggressive, and highly focused stream of physical interaction with that localized collection of data. The 22-watt radio signal, constantly bleeding across billions of miles of empty space, is absolutely not just a line of communication. It is a relentless, physical bombardment of heavily encoded photons. Every single time the massive radio dishes of the deep space network lock onto that faint transmission, and every single time we beam a highly structured command back across the dark, we are actively, physically touching the machine. We are constantly forcing the subatomic particles of its ancient silicon brain, its freezing aluminum chassis, and its spinning gyroscopes to violently interact with the localized reality of Earth. This continuous, unbroken exchange of electromagnetic energy is a massive, sprawling quantum entanglement. We are keeping Voyager solid. By obsessively observing the probe, by meticulously tracking its exact trajectory and decoding its telemetry, we are forcefully, continuously anchoring it to our specific, localized human timeline. But, as we have already established, this physical tether is stretching to its absolute mathematical breaking point. The crushing geometry of the inverse square law is actively executing the signal, and the highly ordered photons connecting our reality to the machine are rapidly, inevitably dissolving into the chaotic, roaring static of the cosmic microwave background. We are rapidly approaching a terrifying, absolute threshold. Sometime in the incredibly near future, the decaying nuclear battery will finally fail to provide the necessary voltage, or the signal will simply become so staggeringly faint that it becomes physically impossible to distinguish from the dead noise of the Big Bang. At that exact, agonizing microsecond, the very last highly structured photon from Voyager will wash over the surface of our planet. The physical exchange of energy will entirely, permanently cease. The continuous quantum measurement that has lasted for decades will abruptly end. This is where the cold, empirical physics of deep space morphs into absolute psychological horror. When that final transmission dies, we will not simply lose communication with a distant spacecraft. We will suffer a catastrophic, macroscopic quantum decoupling. The physical entanglement that binds Voyager to the human timeline will permanently, violently snap. Because the probe is plunging blindly into the deepest, most profoundly isolated ocean of the interstellar medium, entirely surrounded by the freezing, empty vacuum of the true void, there is absolutely nothing out there to interact with it. There is no thick atmosphere to cause friction, no localized solar wind to measure its passage, and no conscious, observing system to look at it. Without the continuous, anchoring tether of our terrestrial observation, and entirely devoid of any meaningful environmental interaction in the absolute dark, Voyager will slip into a state of absolute, unobservable isolation. According to the terrifying, uncompromising mathematics of quantum decoherence, an object that is completely, absolutely isolated from all interaction ceases to possess a definitive, localized state relative to the rest of the universe. When we can no longer measure the probe, when we can no longer exchange physical energy with its systems, it ceases to exist as a solid, fixed object on our timeline. It will mathematically, physically unspool. The rigidly defined coordinates of its trajectory, the solid, metallic architecture of its chassis, and the highly encoded grooves of the golden record will violently regress. Voyager will slowly, inevitably slip back into a macroscopic quantum superposition. Because the universe is no longer being forced to calculate its exact position through the act of our observation, the machine will literally smear out across the infinite probability space of the interstellar void. It will occupy 1 trillion possible locations and no definitive locations simultaneously. You must deeply internalize the suffocating, existential dread of this cosmic erasure. Voyager is not simply going to quietly fly away into the dark, a silent monument endlessly drifting through a cold, physical ocean. By losing the capacity to interact with it, we are fundamentally excising it from the causal web of our reality. The probe will undergo a terrifying, localized ontological deletion. To the localized reality of the Earth, and to the unbroken flow of human history, the machine will completely, existentially vanish. It will become a ghost ship completely decoupled from the fabric of space and time as we understand it, a floating paradox existing only as a chaotic, undefined wave of mathematical probability in a universe that has permanently stopped looking at it. We sent our greatest, most romanticized emissary to physically touch the infinite, completely failing to realize that the infinite is a deeply, highly corrosive solvent that violently dissolves anything it cannot interact with. The impending silence of Voyager is not just the end of a glorious scientific mission. It is the terrifying, empirical proof of our own localized fragility. It proves that the physical reality we desperately cling to is strictly, heavily bounded by our capacity to observe and interact. Our reach is not infinite, and our monuments are absolutely not eternal. The exact moment our sensory organs fail, the exact microsecond the physical tether of observation snaps, the universe brutally and apathetically reclaims the object. We are forced to helplessly watch as the absolute pinnacle of human technological achievement is violently swallowed by the dark, completely unraveled from the causal timeline, and permanently dissolved back into the chaotic, undefined quantum static of a reality that fundamentally refuses to remember anything we are no longer actively looking at. We harbor a profound, almost paralyzing psychological allergy to the concept of our own absolute impermanence. As a deeply conscious, highly emotional species trapped on a fragile rock in a violent cosmos, we look at the inevitable, thermodynamic ticking clock of our biological extinction, and our collective ego violently rebels. We cannot stomach the terrifying, empirical reality that the universe will one day completely forget us. To desperately soothe this suffocating existential dread, we constructed the ultimate macroscopic delusion, a beautiful, deeply poetic, and completely fabricated narrative of cosmic legacy. When we built the Voyager probes, we refused to let them simply be unfeeling scientific instruments measuring magnetic fields and solar winds. We forced them to carry the heavy, impossible burden of human immortality. Bolted to the side of the spacecraft, meticulously engineered and plated in brilliant gold, is a 12-inch copper disc known as the Golden Record. It is humanity's ultimate message in a bottle, a physical, highly concentrated archive of our existence, our art, and our specific location in the galactic grid, blindly hurled into the infinite, roaring ocean of the dark. We romantically, eagerly envision a deeply comforting, heavily sanitized, cinematic future for this artifact. We imagine that millions of years from now, long after the Earth has been violently swallowed by the expanding fire of our dying sun and our civilization has been reduced to unrecognizable subatomic dust, a highly advanced, benevolent extraterrestrial intelligence will smoothly intercept the silent probe. We desperately want to believe that these majestic, enlightened beings will gently detach the pristine golden disc, carefully place a stylus into its microscopic grooves, and solemnly listen to the mathematical perfection of Bach, the rhythmic, desperate beating of a human heart, and the spoken greetings of a dead species. We tell ourselves that the Golden Record is a sacred, indestructible bridge across the infinite void, a guaranteed mechanism that ensures our brief, chaotic spark of consciousness will be forever recognized and deeply mourned by the greater cosmic community. We treat the universe exactly like a serene, highly curated museum, completely and tragically assuming that the cosmos will carefully preserve our artifacts behind protective glass for all eternity. But the universe is absolutely not a museum. It is a highly corrosive, deeply chaotic, and relentlessly violent furnace that actively, mathematically despises highly ordered physical structures. When you strip away the beautiful, comforting poetry of human legacy and subject the Golden Record to the strict, unyielding, and empirical laws of astrophysics and thermodynamics, the romantic lie violently shatters. The artifact is not an eternal monument. It is a profoundly doomed, highly fragile tombstone that has been carelessly tossed directly into a cosmic meat grinder. The interstellar medium, the true vacuum that Voyager is currently plunging blindly into is completely devoid of the peaceful, silent emptiness we arrogantly projected onto it. It is a chaotic, violently churning environment, completely saturated with highly destructive physical hazards. To understand the agonizing, inevitable physical execution of our cosmic greeting card, you must fundamentally understand how the record actually functions. It is an analog medium. The profound, beautiful information it contains: the laughter of a child, the complex sonic frequencies of a symphony, and the highly specific, encoded coordinates of our home planet, is not stored in an abstract, ethereal digital cloud. It is physically, painstakingly carved directly into the metal. The data exists entirely as a microscopic, incredibly fragile topography of jagged ridges and valleys etched into the copper substrate. The golden record is a hyperdense, highly concentrated pocket of absolute physical order. And the second law of thermodynamics strictly dictates that the universe will aggressively, relentlessly work to violently flatten any highly ordered physical structure back into a state of uniform, chaotic, and meaningless equilibrium. Voyager is currently traveling at a staggering, incomprehensible speed of over 38,000 miles per hour through the deep void. At this extreme velocity, the space ahead of the probe is not empty. It is a dense, highly abrasive minefield. The interstellar medium is littered with massive, sprawling clouds of microscopic silicate and carbon-based interstellar dust. In the comforting, sanitized environment of Earth, a microscopic grain of dust is a harmless, floating annoyance. But in the violent physics of deep space, when a fragile copper disk moving at 38,000 miles per hour collides with a stationary speck of cosmic dust, the kinetic energy of that impact is staggeringly, terrifyingly destructive. The dust grain does not simply bounce off the gold plating, it strikes the metal with the localized, kinetic force of a high-velocity ballistic impact. Every single microscopic collision violently flashes a microscopic fraction of the gold plating into superheated plasma, instantly carving a tiny, chaotic impact crater directly into the pristine surface of the artifact. Now, you must forcefully multiply this localized, subatomic violence by millions of years and billions of miles. The golden record is not safely sitting on a shelf. It is being actively, continuously, and aggressively sandblasted by the raw, physical debris of the galaxy. It is a slow, methodical, and entirely inescapable process of physical erasure. The universe is relentlessly raining kinetic shrapnel down upon the artifact, aggressively chipping away the protective gold exterior and brutally exposing the soft, highly vulnerable copper grooves underneath. But the chaotic friction of cosmic dust is only the beginning of the horror. The interstellar medium is also entirely saturated with the decaying, highly radioactive shrapnel of dead, exploded stars. These high-energy galactic cosmic rays, naked protons, and heavy atomic nuclei, traveling at significant fractions of the speed of light, do not merely scratch the surface of the record. They violently penetrate the metal and aggressively alter its fundamental atomic structure. When a high-energy cosmic ray physically strikes the copper substrate, it causes a catastrophic, microscopic phenomenon known as atomic sputtering. The sheer, overwhelming kinetic energy of the subatomic collision violently knocks individual copper atoms completely out of their highly structured, crystalline lattice. permanently ejecting them into the freezing vacuum of space. This means that the universe is not just breaking our artifact, it is actively, meticulously dismantling it atom by agonizing atom. The incredibly delicate, microscopic topography of the grooves, the precise physical ridges that hold the exact sonic frequencies of human existence, are being aggressively, relentlessly flattened. The mathematical perfection of our music and the desperate, pleading voices of our species are being violently degraded, physically ground down by the unyielding radiation of the void. As the millions of years stretch forward into the dark, the distinct, highly organized peaks and valleys of the copper will inevitably, completely collapse. The physical information will be thermodynamically deleted from the universe, permanently lost to the chaotic, apathetic static of maximum entropy. If, by some staggeringly improbable, absurdly mathematically impossible miracle, an advanced extraterrestrial intelligence actually manages to intercept the silent, freezing corpse of Voyager millions of years from now, they will not find a pristine, beautiful archive of a lost civilization. They will find a heavily irradiated, violently scarred, and completely smooth disk of dead metal. If they were to somehow deduce its original purpose and drag a highly sensitive stylus across its ruined surface, they would not hear the majestic, soaring notes of a human symphony, and they would not hear the gentle, loving heartbeat of a mother. They would hear absolutely nothing but the deafening, chaotic, and highly disorganized hiss of raw cosmic static. They would hear the agonizing, distorted sound of microscopic impact craters and radioactive decay. They would hear the exact, terrifying voice of the interstellar medium itself, actively screaming its hatred for structured information. The intricate, deeply precise pulsar map meticulously etched onto the cover of the record, the exact, desperate coordinates detailing the specific location of our home star will be entirely, permanently erased, scrubbed completely clean by the relentless, radioactive sandpaper of the cosmos. We will be absolutely untraceable. The golden record is mathematically guaranteed to be violently stripped of all meaning, completely reverting to a chaotic, useless lump of degraded copper floating blindly in the dark. It is the ultimate, paralyzing proof of our profound, cosmic irrelevance. We frantically tried to carve our names into the fabric of eternity, completely failing to realize that eternity is a violently churning, radioactive ocean that mathematically demands the absolute destruction of memory. The golden record is not a triumphant, permanent monument to the human spirit. It is a desperate, pathetic, biological lie, entirely doomed to be violently, silently erased by a universe that fundamentally refuses to remember us. We are fundamentally trapped by the biological limitations of our terrestrial perspective, heavily conditioned by a localized environment where distance is easily conquered by the aggressive application of combustion and mechanics. When we look at the raw physical telemetry of our most distant machine, we see a number that our primitive, earthbound brains interpret as a staggering, almost incomprehensible velocity. Voyager is currently plunging blindly into the dark at a speed of over 38,000 miles per hour. In the comforting, sanitized, and highly restricted physics of our planetary atmosphere, that velocity is absolutely blistering. It is a speed that violently renders the geography of the Earth entirely obsolete, a kinetic force capable of crossing vast oceans and massive continents in a matter of minutes. We look at that number We look at the archaic, fragile aluminum chassis of the probe, and our collective ego swells with a profound, deeply arrogant sense of technological mastery. We successfully built a machine, strapped it to a controlled chemical explosion, and fired it so incredibly fast that it shattered the gravitational chains of our dying star. We eagerly convince ourselves that we are a majestic, highly advanced species rapidly conquering the cosmos, steadily shrinking the great unknown with our blindingly fast mechanical proxy. But this intoxicating sensation of speed and cosmic mastery is a spectacular, deeply pathetic psychological hallucination. The universe does not measure distance in the trivial, microscopic miles of a terrestrial ape. It measures distance in the agonizing, suffocating, and mathematically crushing geometry of the deep void. And when you subject our blistering, triumphant velocity to the true, unyielding scale of the cosmos, the illusion of human speed violently and completely shatters. We desperately want to believe that by violently punching through the boiling wall of plasma at the termination shock, and by leaving the magnetic biological quarantine zone of the Heliosphere, Voyager has successfully escaped the solar system. We treat the magnetic boundary as the absolute finish line of our local reality. But the sun's tyrannical grip on the physical space around it absolutely does not end with the solar wind. Far beyond the heliopause, stretching out into the freezing pitch-black abyss, for trillions upon trillions of miles, lies the true, absolute gravitational boundary of our localized existence, the Oort cloud. It is not a dense, chaotic asteroid belt from a romanticized science fiction narrative. It is a massive, ghostly, and unimaginably vast spherical shell, completely encapsulating our entire planetary system. It is a deeply hostile, freezing graveyard composed of billions of ancient, icy comets and jagged, dead planetary fragments left over from the violent, chaotic birth of the solar system, hovering silently in the absolute dark, barely held in place by the microscopic, fading gravitational leash of the Sunday. This massive, invisible sphere of dead debris is the true wall of our cosmic prison, and the staggering, paralyzing scale of this barrier fundamentally breaks the human capacity for comprehension. Apply the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of time to our glorious, blistering speed of 38,000 miles per hour. Voyager has been relentlessly, continuously traveling through the freezing vacuum of space for nearly half a century. To the fragile, fiercely temporary biological engine of a human being, 50 years feels like a massive, sprawling epoch. We have fought global wars, constructed a sprawling, hyperdense digital internet, and fundamentally altered the chemical composition of our planet's atmosphere in that brief window of time. But to the agonizing, apathetic scale of the deep cosmos, 50 years of travel at our absolute maximum technological velocity is mathematically indistinguishable from standing perfectly still. It is a microscopic, irrelevant rounding error in the ledger of the void. In order to simply reach the absolute inner edge of the Oort cloud, to just arrive at the starting line of the final gravitational boundary, Voyager must continue its blind, desperate plunge into the dark for another 300 years. 3 entire centuries of relentless, unbroken travel at 38,000 miles per hour just to reach the inner wall of the shell. You must let that staggering temporal weight crush your localized perception of progress. The entire history of the United States of America, from its violent inception to the present day, would have to play out in its entirety once more, just for our fastest machine to reach the very beginning of the edge. But reaching the inner edge is merely the prologue to an infinitely darker, more suffocating mathematical nightmare. To actually cross the Oort cloud, to finally, permanently sever the invisible gravitational tether of the sun and successfully emerge into the open, unobstructed ocean of the interstellar medium, will take the fragile, decaying machine 30,000 years. That number is an absolute biological absurdity. It is a timeline so profoundly, terrifyingly vast that it renders the entire concept of a human scientific mission entirely meaningless. 30,000 years ago, humanity was a highly vulnerable, primitive species of apes, huddled desperately around localized, chemical fires in the dirt, painting the blood of animals onto the cold walls of caves, and living in absolute, paralyzing terror of the dark. The entirety of recorded human civilization, every single towering empire that has ever violently risen and catastrophically collapsed, every sprawling philosophical epoch, and every majestic technological leap we have ever achieved is nothing more than a fleeting microscopic blink of an eye compared to the agonizing frozen transit time of a single, primitive piece of human architecture. By the time Voyager finally breaches the outer wall of the Oort cloud, the physical Earth could be completely, permanently sterile, our fragile biological species entirely extinct, and the towering, concrete monuments of our sprawling civilization completely ground down into unrecognizable dead terrestrial dust. This staggering, paralyzing scale forces a deeply terrifying physical realization about the true nature of deep space travel. When you are completely engulfed by a localized abyss so incredibly, impossibly vast that it mathematically requires 30 millennia to simply cross a single boundary layer, the very concept of kinetic velocity completely loses its physical meaning. If you were to somehow violently project your consciousness across 15 billion miles and instantly inhabit the freezing, heavily irradiated optical sensors of Voyager right now, you would absolutely not experience the thrilling, blinding rush of forward momentum. You would experience absolute, terrifying, and unbroken stasis. Because there are no localized visual reference points, no passing planetary bodies to gauge distance, no atmosphere to generate the chaotic friction of movement, and no light to illuminate the dark, the machine appears to be completely, permanently motionless. It is not flying, it is effectively frozen in place. It is a microscopic, fragile speck of dead, decaying aluminum perfectly suspended in a dark, infinite, and entirely uncrossable abyss. The probe is screaming into the void at 38,000 miles per hour, and yet, geometrically and experientially, it is absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of the emptiness surrounding it. We must violently discard the intoxicating, cinematic delusion of interstellar exploration. We hallucinate a majestic, triumphant future where humanity builds colossal, highly organized generation ships, smoothly sailing across the galaxy to colonize distant, pristine exoplanets, aggressively spreading the highly ordered architecture of human consciousness across the stars. But the unyielding physics of the void violently and mathematically forbid this romanticized fantasy. The uncrossable abyss of the Oort cloud is the ultimate, inescapable empirical proof that human exploration of the deep cosmos is a spectacular biological absurdity. If our absolute fastest, lightest, and most stripped-down mechanical proxy, requires 30,000 years of agonizing, frozen stasis just to cross the physical threshold of our own stellar backyard. The arrogant assumption that we could ever successfully drag a massive, incredibly fragile, and thermodynamically ravenous biological ecosystem across the deep galaxy is a localized delusion of the highest magnitude. The universe has meticulously, deliberately scaled the geometry of the void to guarantee that highly localized biological anomalies like us remain strictly, permanently isolated. We are physically, thermodynamically, and mathematically quarantined to this specific dying rock. Voyager is not a majestic, triumphant explorer boldly mapping the great beyond for the glory of the human empire. It is the tragic, physical manifestation of our absolute confinement. It is a tiny, desperate, and completely doomed mechanical prisoner frantically trying to tunnel out of a massive, pitch-black, solitary confinement cell that is 30 millennia thick. We look out at the staggering, uncrossable abyss, and we are violently forced to realize that the sprawling, beautiful stars we see in the night sky are absolutely not physical destinations waiting to be conquered by our technology. They are simply burning, dying optical illusions projected onto the cold, impenetrable walls of an infinite cage. We are fundamentally trapped, completely surrounded by a suffocating, freezing ocean of distance that actively, aggressively mocks the pathetic, fleeting brevity of our existence, ensuring with absolute mathematical certainty that we will live, we will struggle, and we will inevitably, permanently die entirely alone in the dark. We have reached the absolute, staggering limit of our technological reach. And in doing so, we have discovered the absolute, crushing limit of our relevance. We have spent nearly half a century desperately projecting a majestic, triumphant narrative onto the Voyager mission, portraying these two fragile machines as the ultimate symbols of human bravery and unyielding curiosity. We have conditioned ourselves to view Voyager as a bold pioneer, a mechanical hero conquering the deep stars and carrying the proud legacy of Earth into the infinite. But tonight, as we stand at the terrifying precipice of total communication failure, we are forced to violently discard that romanticized, macroscopic lie. Voyager is absolutely not a triumphant explorer. It is a fragile, dying sensory organ that we violently, and perhaps cruelly, pushed out of our protective biological bubble. It is a microscopic, heavily irradiated nerve ending that we have extended into a freezing, radioactive ocean that is currently, methodically, and violently dismantling it. We are not witnessing the expansion of the human empire. We are witnessing the slow, agonizing, and entirely inescapable execution of a human machine by the hostile, true physics of the interstellar void. To comprehend the profound tragedy of Voyager's final years, you must view the probe not as a spacecraft, but as a biological extension of ourselves. When we built the Deep Space Network and pointed its massive, monolithic radio dishes toward the outer dark, we effectively created a 15 billion mile long nervous system. For decades, this system has allowed us to feel the localized temperature, the magnetic fluctuations, and the plasma density of the solar system as if it were our own skin. But we have pushed this sensory organ too far. We have forced it through the boiling wall of fire at the termination shock and dragged it into the raw, unshielded vacuum of the interstellar medium. Voyager is now screaming back at us in the digital language of ones and zeros, because it is being physically and mathematically burned by a reality it was never designed to perceive. The glitches, the stuttering telemetry, and the terrifying descent into cosmic aphasia are the frantic, reflexive responses of a system that is being overwhelmed by the catastrophic energy of the true universe. We are desperately trying to listen to the report of an explorer, but we are actually just hearing the terminal screams of a victim. The physical mechanism of this death is absolute, unyielding, and entirely dictated by the laws of thermodynamics. Deep within the freezing, aluminum chassis of the probe, the three radioisotope thermoelectric generators, the nuclear hearts of the machine, are in a state of irreversible, accelerating decay. The pellets of plutonium-238, which have provided the steady, glowing warmth necessary to keep the silicon brain alive for 47 years, are slowly, relentlessly cooling. Every single day, the thermal energy output drops by a microscopic but mathematically significant fraction. The universe is extracting the heat from the probe's heart and dispersing it into the infinite, freezing void, perfectly adhering to the unyielding demand for maximum entropy. To stave off the impending total freeze, the engineers on Earth have been forced to act as a cosmic triage team, systematically and violently amputating the probe's functionality. One by one, the heaters have been deactivated. The scientific instruments, the eyes and ears we use to map the gas giants have been permanently turned off, leaving the machine blind and deaf in the absolute dark. We are watching a slow-motion biological shutdown, a mechanical organ failing in real time as the energy required to maintain its highly ordered structure is ruthlessly reclaimed by the apathetic vacuum. Sometime in the incredibly near future, perhaps in only a few years, the final, terrifying threshold will be crossed. The voltage generated by the cooling nuclear heart will drop below the absolute minimum required to power the 22-watt transmitter. At that exact, agonizing microsecond, the final pulse of structured electromagnetic energy will leave the probe. It will begin its 22-hour journey through the radioactive graveyard of the interstellar medium, across the turbulent heliopause, and through the boiling wall of the termination shock. But back on Earth, the massive radio dishes will wait in absolute, deafening silence. The tiny, flickering light of the refrigerator bulb will finally, permanently go out. The invisible quantum tether that has anchored Voyager to our localized reality for half a century will violently snap. The human nervous system will be permanently severed, and our farthest sensory organ will be plunged into a state of absolute, unobservable isolation. This is the moment when Voyager ceases to be a piece of human history and becomes a ghost. Without the anchor of our observation, and without the physical exchange of information that keeps its quantum state definitive, the machine will fundamentally vanish from our localized timeline. It will no longer be a solid, measurable object occupying a specific coordinate in the void. It will become a smeared, undefined wave of probability drifting blindly through a 30,000-year thick cage of icy debris in the Oort cloud. The golden record, our desperate message in a bottle, will continue its lonely transit, but it will be a silent, ruined artifact. The microscopic, high-velocity sandblasting of interstellar dust and the subatomic bombardment of galactic cosmic rays will continue their relentless work, methodically flattening the grooves of our music and erasing the map of our home. Every single trace of our existence, every note of our symphonies, and every greeting we so arrogantly etched into that gold-plated copper will be ground down into unrecognizable, dead metallic static. Voyager will be swallowed whole by the dark, its physical architecture digested by the cosmos until absolutely nothing of our presence remains. We are forced to confront the absolute, paralyzing hostility of the true universe. We look up at the stars, and we see beauty, we see destiny, and we see an invitation. But Voyager has proven, with cold empirical ruthlessness, that the stars are not an invitation. They are distant, burning furnaces separated by an uncrossable, radioactive abyss that actively, aggressively seeks to dismantle anything we send into it. The universe has meticulously constructed a series of violent, boiling barriers to keep us quarantined within our localized biological terrarium. We are a fragile, temporary glitch of order in a reality that mathematically demands chaos, and our boldest attempt at immortality is currently being turned into dust by a void that does not even know we exist. The impending silence of our farthest emissary is the ultimate, inescapable proof of our profound, cosmic isolation. We are not a species of interstellar explorers. We are a species of tragic, localized prisoners, desperately shouting into a roaring hurricane that is guaranteed to drown us out. The story of Voyager is not a story of conquest. It is a story of a message that will never be delivered, a map that leads to a planet that will eventually be erased, and a machine that was broken by the very reality it tried to understand. We are the architects of a magnificent digital tragedy. We hurled a piece of ourselves into the infinite, and the infinite is currently crushing it to death. As the final bits of data dissolve into the cosmic microwave background and the tether to the Earth permanently breaks, we are left with a terrifying realization that entirely shatters our collective ego. We are fundamentally alone, trapped on a tiny, dying rock, completely surrounded by a universe that is so profoundly hostile, so unimaginably vast, and so aggressively apathetic that it can swallow the absolute pinnacle of our achievement without leaving a single microscopic ripple in the dark. Does the impending silence of Voyager make you feel a profound sense of human isolation? Or does it terrify you to realize just how hostile the true universe actually is? This is the fundamental, existential question that Voyager leaves behind as its legacy. It is the cold, empirical feedback of a machine that has seen the true face of the void and found it to be utterly, catastrophically incompatible with our existence. We are a brief, beautiful misfire in a dark room, and the room is exponentially larger and more dangerous than we ever dared to imagine. As the last signal fades and the darkness reclaims its own, we are forced to sit in the silence and wonder if we were ever meant to be heard at all. Good night, and I will see you in the next video here at Still Science Lab.